There is a stretch of water off the coast of Yemen so narrow that a person standing on one shore can, on a clear day, make out the mountains on the other. It is about 18 miles across at its tightest point. And for the better part of the last 3 years, the question of whether ships can safely pass through it has determined the price of the shoes on your feet, the parts inside your car, and the fuel in your tank. This is the Bab el-Mandeb. The name translates, roughly, as the Gate of Tears. Nobody named it that because of shipping. But the name has aged extremely well. If you find this kind of story interesting, the kind where the thing everybody assumed was permanent turns out to have been held together by assumption alone, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. Let's start with what this waterway actually is, because the scale of it is difficult to hold in your head. The Bab el-Mandeb sits between Djibouti on the African side and Yemen on the Arabian side. It is the southern gate of the Red Sea. Ships coming from Asia cross the Indian Ocean, round the Horn of Africa, pass through the Gulf of Aden, squeeze through this 18-mile gap, then run north up the length of the Red Sea for more than 1,000 miles until they reach the Suez Canal, which spits them out into the Mediterranean. In a normal year, roughly 12% of all global seaborne trade moves through that gap, around 30% of the world's container traffic, something close to 10% of all seaborne oil and refined petroleum products. Well over $1 trillion of goods annually, funneling through a strip of water you could cross in a small boat in under an hour. Consumer electronics from Shenzhen, automotive components from Korea, machinery from Japan, furniture, textiles, pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals. All of it, every year, threading a needle between two coastlines. And the reason it goes that way rather than any other way is simple arithmetic. A ship sailing from Shanghai to Rotterdam through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal covers roughly 3,500 fewer nautical miles than a ship sailing around the southern tip of Africa. That is 10 to 14 days saved on every single voyage, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel not burned, an entire extra rotation squeezed out of each vessel every year. For decades, the shipping industry did not treat that route as a choice. It treated it as a fact. Schedules were built around it. Charter rates assumed it. Just-in-time manufacturing across Europe was quietly engineered on the premise that a container leaving Asia would arrive on a predictable date, and that predictable date depended entirely on the Red Sea being open. Which brings us to the assumptions. There were 3 of them, and all 3 were held with total confidence by people who were paid to be right about exactly this. The first assumption was that no non-state armed group could sustain an effective interdiction campaign against international shipping in open water. Piracy, yes. Somali pirates had been a serious nuisance in these same waters for years. But piracy is a business model. Pirates want the ship intact, and the crew alive, because that is what gets paid. A campaign designed to make a waterway genuinely unusable is a completely different thing, and the consensus was that it required a state, a navy, and a budget. The second assumption was that if such a campaign somehow materialized, modern naval power would end it quickly. Carrier air wings, guided missile destroyers, Aegis combat systems capable of tracking and engaging dozens of targets simultaneously. The prevailing view was that cheap anti-ship missiles and improvised attack boats would be swatted out of the sky, the launch sites would be located and destroyed, and the whole thing would be over in a matter of weeks. The third assumption was the commercial one. That shipping lines, operating under the protection of allied naval coalitions, would never actually abandon one of the most valuable trade arteries in human history. The route was too important. The economics were too favorable. Somebody would keep sailing. Every one of those 3 assumptions turned out to be wrong. Starting in late 2023, the Houthi movement in Yemen began attacking commercial vessels transiting the southern Red Sea, framing the campaign as a response to the war in Gaza. They were operating from mobile launch positions across the mountainous terrain of western Yemen, and what they demonstrated over the following months was that a mass-produced arsenal of anti-ship ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and remote-controlled explosive boats could impose something that functioned, in practice, as a blockade. The United States, the United Kingdom, and a coalition of European navies responded with sustained airstrikes, precision bombardment of radar and launch infrastructure, and the interception of hundreds of incoming projectiles. And the campaign did not stop. Here is the part that should have been obvious in advance and somehow was not. Consider the exchange rate of a naval engagement. A warship defending itself against an incoming drone fires an interceptor. Depending on the system, that interceptor costs somewhere between $1 and $4 million. The drone it is destroying might cost $20,000, sometimes considerably less. Now run that math across hundreds of engagements. The defending side wins every individual encounter and loses the campaign anyway, because the magazines run dry, the resupply chain cannot keep pace, and each destroyer can only carry so many missiles before it has to leave station and sail to a port to reload. The attacker does not need to sink ships. The attacker needs the ships to keep coming and needs the defenders to keep spending. That is asymmetry working exactly as designed, and it broke the defensive model in public. But the thing that actually closed the Red Sea was not military at all. It was insurance. Every commercial vessel carries hull and cargo cover, and standard marine policies specifically exclude war risk. To transit a war risk area, an operator has to buy a separate endorsement, priced as a percentage of the vessel's value. Before the crisis, Red Sea war risk premiums sat at a small fraction of 1%. As attacks mounted, underwriters repriced. Rates climbed to figures in the region of 0.5% to 1% of cargo value, and for some vessels considerably higher depending on flag, ownership, and prior port calls. On a vessel and cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that is hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance alone, for one transit, each way. At that point, the arithmetic that had made the Red Sea route unquestionable simply inverted. The fuel savings no longer covered the risk premium, and so the largest container carriers on Earth, Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Hapag-Lloyd, and CMA-CGM, suspended Red Sea operations and sent their fleets around the Cape of Good Hope. The people who closed the Bab el-Mandeb were not, in the final analysis, missile operators in Yemen. They were actuaries in London. What happened next is the part that most coverage got wrong at the time, because it was described as a delay. It was not a delay, it was a capacity crisis. When you add 10 to 14 days to every leg of a voyage, and the voyage runs both directions, you have added something like 3 to 4 weeks to a round trip that previously took around 60 days. That vessel is now performing meaningfully fewer rotations per year. Multiply that across every ship on the Asia to Europe trade, and you have removed a large slice of global shipping capacity from the market without a single container ever being lost. Estimates of the effect vary, but the working figures used by freight analysts put the absorption at something in the range of 5 to 7% of global container capacity, equivalent to well over 1 million 20-foot equivalent units taken out of circulation. And critically, that capacity was drained from the entire system, not just from the affected route. Ships are fungible. A vessel stuck on a longer Asia to Europe rotation is a vessel that is not available to be chartered onto a trans-Pacific service. Rates rose on trade lanes that never went anywhere near the Red Sea, and importers in North America found themselves paying more for a route that had not changed at all. Spot rates from Shanghai to Northern Europe tripled within weeks at the peak. European manufacturers running just-in-time production found component deliveries arriving late and idled assembly lines. Retailers absorbed higher inventory holding costs and pushed delivery dates back, and every one of those costs eventually arrived at the same destination, which is a shelf price. Then there is Egypt. The Suez Canal is not just infrastructure for Egypt. It is one of the country's largest sources of foreign currency, alongside tourism and remittances. And when ships stopped entering the Red Sea from the south, they stopped arriving at Suez from the south as well. In the fiscal year ending in June of 2023, Canal revenue hit a record of roughly $9.4 billion. By 2024, it had collapsed to around $4 billion. In a single quarter at the depth of the crisis, revenue fell from roughly $2.4 billion to under $900 million. For a country already managing a foreign exchange shortage and serious inflation, that was a fiscal wound, with no quick remedy. Egypt had done nothing, provoked nobody, and controlled none of the relevant variables. It simply happened to own the northern end of a corridor that somebody else had closed. The Suez Canal Authority responded the only way it could, with pricing. It offered discounts to large container vessels to lure carriers back. It leaned harder on the Suez Canal economic zone, pushing industrial investment, ship maintenance, bunkering, and logistics services, trying to build revenue that did not depend on how many hulls passed through the ditch that year. That is a sensible strategy. It is also an admission that transit revenue had stopped being something Egypt could count on. Meanwhile, planners across the region went looking for a way around the water entirely. The most discussed workaround was an overland corridor. Containers landed at deepwater ports in the United Arab Emirates and Oman, loaded onto long-haul trucks, driven across Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and delivered to Mediterranean ports for onward shipment into southern Europe. On paper, it worked. It cut the Gulf to Mediterranean leg down to a matter of days and bypassed the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea completely. In practice, it ran directly into physics. A single ultra-large container vessel can carry up to 24,000 20-foot equivalent units. To move that cargo overland, you would need a fleet of more than 12,000 heavy trucks, operating in near-perfect coordination, clearing multiple national borders, with customs capacity to match at every checkpoint. And that is one ship. The highway networks, the border crossings, and the customs infrastructure of the region were never built to absorb tens of millions of tons of maritime freight. Overland corridors could function as a premium lifeline for urgent, high-value, low-volume cargo, electronics, pharmaceuticals, perishables. They could never function as a structural replacement for open ocean container shipping, and the people running them knew it. The same is true of every other proposed alternative. Sea-air routing through Dubai works for a small slice of freight at several times the cost. China to Europe rail moves in the region of 18 to 22 days and has a fraction of the capacity. These are release valves, not substitutes. Which brings us to the part of the story that most explainers stop before, and it is the part that changes what the whole thing means. Because the crisis ended, and then it did not stay ended. After the Gaza ceasefire agreement in October of 2025, Houthi attacks on commercial shipping stopped. Traffic began cautiously to return. By early 2026, carriers were running test transits. Maersk, which had been among the most risk-averse operators throughout the crisis, sent vessels back through Suez. Mediterranean Shipping Company and CMA-CGM piloted selected sailings. Suez revenue started climbing again. The word being used in the industry was normalization. It lasted about 4 months. In late February of 2026, the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran. Iran retaliated in the most direct way available to it, which was to make the Strait of Hormuz unusable. Understand what that means, because Hormuz is not a secondary choke point. Roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne crude oil trade passes through it, along with close to a fifth of global liquefied natural gas. It is about 21 miles wide at its narrowest. Iran attacked commercial vessels, laid naval mines, and declared Allied shipping legitimate targets. Traffic collapsed. On some published figures, transits fell to around 10 vessels a day against a normal baseline of roughly 88 to 130. Oil moved above $100 a barrel. Insurers withdrew cover. More than 1,000 vessels were reported stranded, with tens of thousands of mariners aboard them. And at the same time, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea resumed. So consider the position the world's shipping industry now found itself in. The Gulf's primary exit was closed. The Red Sea, the corridor everyone had abandoned 2 years earlier, briefly became the escape route, with Saudi Arabia pivoting crude exports westward to its Red Sea terminals at Yanbu to get oil out of the region without going through Hormuz at all. Traffic through the Bab el-Mandeb actually increased. Then on the 20th of July 2026, the Houthis announced a maritime blockade of Saudi Arabia. 2 days later, they claimed strikes on 2 Saudi tankers, the Encelia and the Layla. Saudi authorities confirmed the Encelia had been hit and said the crew were safe. The escape route had a gate on it too. Bab el-Mandeb transits fell by roughly a quarter in the following week, from around 354 to around 269. And then, notably, they stabilized. Container lines mostly kept sailing. The disruption concentrated in the tanker market, where mainstream tanker traffic dropped by something close to 40%, while box ship movements barely moved. Here is where I want to be honest about the limits of what anyone actually knows. A significant and growing share of vessels in these waters are now transiting with their automatic identification system, transponders, switched off. That is partly a security measure. Maritime authorities have advised vessels that broadcasting their position makes them easier to target. It is partly an attempt at strategic ambiguity, with some vessels broadcasting ownership and crew details apparently intended to signal neutrality. And it is partly the ordinary business of the shadow fleet moving sanctioned oil, which has its own reasons for going dark. The consequence is that the traffic figures being reported are undercounts of unknown size. Analysts publishing these numbers say so directly, and revise them upward as more data arrives. When you see a chart of Bab el-Mandeb transits, you are looking at the visible portion of the traffic, not the traffic. That is not a small caveat. It means that our ability to measure the health of the single most important trade corridor on Earth has degraded at precisely the moment we most needed to measure it. So what has permanently changed? Not the geography. The geography was always like this. What changed is that a specific belief died, and it died in public, in front of every shipping executive, insurance underwriter, and finance ministry on the planet. The belief was that naval supremacy guarantees commercial passage. It does not. It never did. What it guaranteed was that the coastal actor would lose any conventional fight, which turns out to be a completely different question from whether merchant traffic can get through. When the coastal geography favors the attacker, when the weapons are cheap and proliferated, and when the defender has to be right every single time while the attacker only has to be credible, the waterway closes regardless of who would win a battle. The industry has responded accordingly. Cape of Good Hope routing has been built into long-term scheduling models as a baseline scenario rather than an emergency measure, with the fuel cost and the extra weeks absorbed as the price of doing business. Freight forwarders are telling importers to plan for diversions running through at least 2027. European importers are accelerating nearshoring of critical inputs to Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Turkey, specifically to reduce the number of choke points between a factory and its components. Port operators along the west and south coasts of Africa are investing in bunkering and berth capacity to service traffic that used to have no reason to go anywhere near them. And underneath all of it sits a recalculation that is harder to see but matters more. Route risk used to be modeled as an occasional shock, priced accordingly, and otherwise ignored. It is now being modeled as a persistent condition. That changes where factories get built, which suppliers get contracts, how much inventory sits in a warehouse instead of on a ship, and ultimately what things cost. The modern global economy was designed on the assumption that a handful of narrow gaps in the map would stay open, because they always had, and because keeping them open was in everybody's interest. The last 3 years established that being in everybody's interest is not the same thing as being guaranteed. That a party with no navy, no economy to speak of, and no interest in the health of global trade can close one of these gaps and keep it closed. And that when two of them close at once, there is no third option, because the alternatives were never alternatives. They were pressure release valves that we mistook for redundancy. The Gate of Tears is 18 miles wide. The entire architecture of globalized commerce assumed it would stay open, and never wrote down what would happen if it did not. Now we know. If you got something out of this, subscribe, because we go deep on the systems everyone assumes are stable, right up until they aren't. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.